So here's something that happened to almost every one of you before you turned 6 years old. You watched a Disney movie, and in that movie, someone died. Mufasa fell into the gorge. Bambi's mother vanished into the snow. Ellie from Up was here, and then she just wasn't. And in that moment, sitting on your living room floor with juice on your shirt and your whole life ahead of you, you absorb your first cultural lesson about death. Death is a thing that takes people away from you. Death is what the villain does. Death is what the hero fights against. The whole point of the story is to stop death, outsmart death, avenge death, reverse death. And if you can't do any of those things, you cry, you play sad music, you stare at the rain like a French art film protagonist who just lost a baguette. By the time you're an adult, you have absorbed this message through thousands of films, hundreds of TV shows, and an entire entertainment infrastructure built around one central premise: death is the enemy.
And here's the thing that stopped both of us cold when we started pulling at this thread. For the vast majority of human history, death wasn't the villain, death was the teacher. In some traditions, death was the guest of honor. In others, death was the doorway you dressed up for. The Stoics meditated on it daily. Hindu philosophy built entire cosmological systems around it. Tibetan Buddhists wrote an entire user manual for navigating it, centuries before anyone thought to write one for an iPhone. Indigenous cultures across 6 continents built elaborate, beautiful, community-centered rituals, not to fight death, but to welcome it. And then, somewhere in the last 150 years, we collectively decided all those people were wrong. We medicalized dying. We institutionalized grief. We outsourced the dead to funeral homes and mortuaries. And we handed the cultural narrative about death to Hollywood. The people who think a satisfying ending is a building exploding in slow motion.
Today on Monday Mismatch, we are tracing how that happened, what your brain is actually doing when it encounters death, why Hollywood exploits that writing so effectively, and what a growing movement of death doulas and end-of-life practitioners is doing to correct one of the most consequential mismatches in modern life. And because this one isn't about your phone, your diet, or your sleep schedule, this one is about how you're going to handle the only guaranteed event of your entire existence. No pressure.
I'm Sarah.
And I'm Vish. We are the co-founders of The Wired Ape, and every Monday on Mismatch Monday, we take one modern problem that nearly everyone experiences and reverse engineering it through evolutionary biology. Because here's what we believe: we're not broken, you're not weak, you're not doing it wrong. You're a 300,000-year-old animal running ancient biological software in a world that updates its operating system every 6 months without asking permission.
Today's mismatch: how modern Western culture turned death into a villain, and why that's making all of us, genuinely, worse at living. By the end of this episode, you'll understand 3 things. First, what's actually happening in your brain when you think about death, and why raw fear is only half of the neurological story. Second, how Hollywood became the most powerful death narrative machine in human history, and what that cost to us psychologically. Third, what death doulas, the death positive movement, and wisdom traditions across the planet are doing that your ancestors would recognize immediately, because it's what humans were designed to do all along.
Quick note before we dive in: this episode is for educational and exploratory purposes. We're not providing medical, psychological, or end-of-life planning advice. If you or someone you love is navigating death and dying right now, please work with qualified professionals. We'll point you toward these resources at the end.
Also, if you're thinking, wow, cheerful Monday morning topic, just wait. This one actually lands somewhere hopeful. We promise.
Well, let's get into it. Let's start with the numbers, because the numbers are genuinely wild. Kaiser Family Foundation survey found that roughly 69% of Americans say that in their society, death is a subject people generally avoid. Let that land for a second. 7 out of 10 people living in a country where death is the single most certain event any of them will ever face agree that their culture does not want to talk about it. We have built skyscrapers, we have split the atom, we put a car in the orbit around Mars, but a conversation about the one thing that literally everyone in the room is going to experience, nah, too awkward. Pass the guacamole.
And it gets worse. An ethos survey asked Americans to rate their willingness to discuss traditionally taboo topics. Death came in dead last. And yes, that pun is fully intended. Behind money, behind mental health, behind sex, behind politics and religion. Only 32% of Americans said they were willing to talk about death. People would rather discuss their salaries, their anxieties, their bedroom habits, and their voting records than the one thing every single person in the room is going to experience. You will sooner hear someone at a dinner party say, "So, my therapist thinks I have attachment issues," than, "So, have you thought about what you want done with your body?"
And here's where the gap gets really interesting and really generational. Nearly half of Americans, about 45%, think about death at least monthly. Among Gen Z, 35% think about death every single day. That's more than any other generation. But despite thinking about it constantly, they still do not want to talk about it. Among Gen Z, only 45% think it's even important to discuss end of life planning, compared to 74% of boomers and Gen X.
So, we've got an entire generation that's essentially doom scrolling their own mortality in their heads daily, but can't bring themselves to have a 10-minute conversation about it out loud. That's not a quirk. That's not generational laziness. That's a mismatch.
And the consequences are real and measurable. About 37% of Americans haven't done anything to prepare for death. Among millennials, that figure is 46%. Two-thirds of Americans say discussing end-of-life preparations with their loved ones is important, but fewer than half have actually done it. We are a culture that knows what it should do and category refuses to do it. It's like knowing you need to floss, but the floss is your own funeral arrangements, and the dentist is the grim reaper.
Now, here's where Hollywood enters the frame, and we don't mean politely. The average American consumes somewhere between 4 to 6 hours of screen media per day. Over a lifetime, that's roughly 15 years of your waking life spent watching stories. 15 years. You could learn 6 languages in that time. You could become a concert pianist. Instead, you've essentially earned a PhD in fictional dying.
And in those stories, death follows a remarkably consistent script. It comes in exactly 3 flavors, and none of them are nutritious. Flavor 1 is death is the villain, Grim Reaper, the monster, the serial killer, the disease. Death is the antagonist the hero must defeat. Every action movie where the hero survives against impossible odds. Every medical drama where the surgeon fights to save the patient. Every horror film where death stalks characters one by one while they make terrible decisions about splitting up. The message: death is something that happens to you, and only appropriate response is to fight it with a sword, a scalpel, or a really dramatic speech. Flavor 2: death is tragedy, the tearjerker, the slow fade, the piano music, and the hospital bed. When death cannot be defeated, it becomes the worst possible outcome. The surviving characters are devastated. The audience cries, everyone reaches for tissues. The message: death is loss, pure and simple. It ruins everything it touches, and your job is to feel as bad as possible about it. Flavor 3: death is spectacle, the explosion, the battle sequence, the villain plunging from a great height. Hollywood has so thoroughly turned death into entertainment that we watch hundreds of people die in a single Marvel film and feel nothing. Because those deaths are designed to thrill, not to teach. They are narrative confetti.
Death is a communal experience. Death as something a family gathers around with intention, with ritual, with presence. Death is something you could prepare for consciously, the way you'd prepare for a birth or a marriage, because it carries the same weight and the same sacredness. There's actually a documented trope called the Disney villain death, where the bad guy falls to their demise from a great height, so the hero doesn't have to carry the moral weight of killing. It's so common it has its own encyclopedia entry. Death is sanitized, externalized, and turned into narrative resolution. The villain dies so the hero's hands stay clean and the audience's conscience stays undisturbed.
And we absorb these patterns early. Before a child has any personal experience with death, they've already been trained by hundreds of hours of media to understand death as the ultimate bad thing. Not a transition, not a threshold, not a natural part of being alive. The bad thing. Now, as we'll see in a minute, your brain is already primed by evolution to fear death. Hollywood didn't create that fear. What Hollywood did was amplify it, commercialize it, and systematically strip away every cultural counterweight that used to keep it in balance. Alright, let's go inside the wiring. Because your brain is doing something far more interesting with death than just screaming run. Your brain has what we might call the two death systems, and understanding the tension between them is the key to understanding this entire mismatch. System 1 is the threat detection system. This is ancient hardware, deep firmware. We are talking about your amygdala, that almond-shaped structure deep in your temporal lobe that acts as your brain's smoke alarm. Your HPA axis, which stands for hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which is a hormonal cascade system that floods your brain with cortisol and adrenaline when danger appears. Your fight or flight circuitry, all of it firing when something signals mortal danger. When a predator appeared on the savannah, This system kept your ancestors alive. Heart rate up, cortisol flooding, attention narrowing to the heart. Every ounce of cognitive resource redirected toward one goal. Do not become lunch.
And here's the kicker. This system doesn't distinguish between a lion in the grass and a thought about your own mortality. When you lie awake at 2 a.m. contemplating the fact that you will someday cease to exist, the same circuits activate. Not as intensely as facing a physical predator, but the neurological signature is there. Your brain treats the idea of death as a threat to be managed because that's what this hardware was built to do.
Now in 1973, a cultural anthropologist named Ernst Becker published a book called The Denial of Death. It won the Pulitzer Prize posthumously, which is either deeply ironic or deeply fitting depending on your worldview. So Becker's central thesis was strikingly similar. The majority of human action is undertaken primarily as a means to ignore or evade death. He argued that human civilization itself, all of it, the skyscrapers, the symphonies, and the stock market, is an elaborate symbolic defense mechanism against the knowledge of your own mortality. We built the pyramids because we are terrified of dying. That's Becker's argument, and he makes it convincingly enough to win a Pulitzer.
Becker introduced the concept of what he called immortality projects, sometimes referred to as causa sui projects, from the Latin meaning cause of itself. The idea is that because we can't physically transcend death, we do it symbolically. We build empires, we write books, we have children, we accumulate wealth, we create religions, we join movements, we post on Instagram. All of these, Becker argued, are strategies for making some part of us feel like it will outlast our biological expiration date. Your LinkedIn profile, immortality project. Your family photo wall, immortality project. That novel you've been working on for 7 years, immortality project. And also possibly an avoidance project, but we'll leave that one alone.
This wasn't just philosophy. You see, in the 1980s, three social psychologists named Jeff Greenberg, Sheldon Solomon, and Tom Pyszczynski took Becker's ideas and turned them into one of the most fascinating empirical research programs in modern psychology. They called it terror management theory, or TMT. Their hypothesis was straightforward. If Becker is right that we manage death anxiety through cultural worldviews and self-esteem, then making people think about death should intensify their attachment to those psychological defenses. They tested this using what they called mortality salience manipulations, a term that sounds like a CIA program, but is actually just asking people to write a short paragraph about what will happen to them when they die, and then measuring how their attitudes and behaviors change afterward. That's it. Write about dying for 5 minutes, then we see what happens to your personality.
And what happened was remarkable. A meta-analysis covering 277 experiments found that when people are reminded of their mortality, they become more defensive of their cultural worldviews. They judge people who violate their values more harshly. They reward people who confirm their beliefs more generously. They become more nationalistic, more religiously committed, more attached to their in-group. They even become more materialistic and more inclined towards conspicuous consumption.
In other words, when your brain detects that threat of death, even abstractly, even through a 5-minute writing exercise, it does not just trigger fear. It triggers an entire cascade of identity reinforcing behaviors designed to shore up your symbolic immortality project. You just do not feel scared, you become more yourself, but in a defensive, rigid, contracted way. Think about it. Someone reminds you that you're going to die, and your brain's response is to buy a more expensive watch and be meaner to people who disagree with you. That's not rational. That's a 1,000 years of survival, wiring going haywire in a world it wasn't designed for.
Now, here's the part that matters for our story, because here's where the evolutionary picture gets genuinely beautiful and genuinely sad at the same time. System 2, what we'll call the death integration system. And this is where the mismatch lives. Because here's where what Becker and the TMT researchers recognized, but didn't fully develop. For the vast majority of human history, death wasn't just a threat to be managed in isolation. It was a communal event to be processed together. In small-scale ancestral societies, death happened in the group. There was no hospital to transfer grandma to. There was no mortuary to handle the body. There was no insurance company to manage the aftermath, and frankly, no hold music to endure while you tried to file the claim. When someone died, the entire band or tribe participated in the dying, death, and the mourning. It was a whole community event, like a barn raising, but for grief.
Tool they used was ritual. Ritual is a technology or ancestors built to metabolize mortality. Every human culture that has ever been documented, and I do mean every single one, has death rituals. From the 100,000-year-old evidence of intentional burial at Kafse cave in Israel, to the sky burials of Tibet, to the jazz funerals of New Orleans. Human beings have been processing death through collective, embodied, often multi-day ceremonies for as long as we have been recognizably human. This isn't cultural decoration. This is core technology. Death ritual is to grieve what fire is to cold, the thing that made the unbearable survivable.
And what these rituals did neurologically was activate the other side of the death response, not the fear side, the meaning making side. Collective grief rituals trigger oxytocin release, the bonding and trust hormone. They involve synchronized movement and group vocalizing, chanting, singing, wailing, which we know from research on collective effervescence, a concept from sociologist Emo Durkheim, produces profound feelings of group cohesion and transcendence. They create narrative containers for loss, which help the prefrontal cortex, the brain's executive function center, integrate an overwhelming emotional experience into a coherent life story.
In plain English, our ancestors didn't deny death or collapse under it. They had cultural technologies that allowed them to hold both realities at the same time. Death is terrifying and death is meaningful. Death takes people from us and death connects us more deeply to each other. They carried both truths in the same hand, and the rituals were the hand. This is a dual system we evolved with. System 1, threat detection, to keep you alive in the moment. Step 2, ritual integration, to keep you psychologically whole over a lifetime. Both essential, both ancient, both wired in.
So now we see the collision. Modern Western culture has amplified System 1, the fear system, to an extraordinary degree through Modern Western culture has amplified System 1, the fear system, to an extraordinary degree through media, medicine, and market forces. And at the same time, it has systematically dismantled System 2, the integration system, by removing death from the home, from the community, and from everyday consciousness. Let's trace when this happened, because it didn't happen all at once. It was a slow 150-year unraveling.
In the mid 1800s, death was still a household event in most of the Western world. People died at home, families vanished and prepared the body, neighbors came, children were present. The wake happened in the parlor, which is literally what we used to call it, the parlor. It was a room where you received the dead. Even the funeral industry professionalized. Embalming became standard practice during the American Civil War. Because bodies needed preservation for transport, funeral homes appeared, hospitals expanded, and by the mid 20th century, the majority of Americans were dying in institutional settings, surrounded by medical staff rather than family.
That shift from home to hospital, from community to institution, didn't just change logistics, it changed psychology. When death happens behind closed doors, attended by professionals in scrubs rather than family in their own clothes, the communal processing system breaks down. You don't see death happening. You don't touch it. You don't participate in it. You get a phone call. You drive to a building. Someone in a suit handles everything. And your brain's integration system, the one that needs embodied, collective, ritualized experience to function, gets nothing to work with. It's like having a digestive system, but never being given food.
And into that vacuum stepped Hollywood. The timing is almost too perfect. Just as death was disappearing from the lived experience, the motion picture industry was ramping up. By the 1920s and 30s, movies became the dominant storytelling medium in Western culture. And movies needed villains. They needed stakes. They needed something for the hero to fight against. Death was the obvious candidate. It already terrified everyone. It was already being hidden from daily life and could be repackaged into 1,000 entertaining ways. The monster, the disease, the war, serial killer, the ticking clock. Hollywood did not invent death anxiety. What Hollywood did was become the primary cultural institution through which most Westerners encounter death narratives, and it offered exactly one framework: death is the enemy.
And the industries around death reinforce this. The funeral industry, worth roughly $20 billion in the US alone, has a financial incentive to keep death feeling overwhelming and unmanageable. If you feel competent to handle death yourself, to wash a body, to hold a vigil, to bury someone on your own land, you don't need their services. The medical industrial complex has a similar alignment. If death is the enemy, then every possible intervention to delay it is justified, regardless of quality of life. The pharmaceutical industry, the insurance industry, the grief counseling industry, all of them benefit from a population that treats death as a crisis rather than as a natural process.
So let's map the mismatch precisely here. Your ancestral environment, death happens in the community. You see it, you touch it, you participate in multi-day rituals that activate oxytocin, collective effervescence, and narrative integration. Both brain systems, fear and meaning, are engaged. The fear is real, but it's held inside a container of community, story, and ceremony. Your modern environment happens behind institutional walls. You don't see it, you don't touch it, or participate in it. Instead, you encounter thousands of fictional deaths through screens, each one triggering your mortality, Saline's response without providing any ritual container for processing it. System 1 gets hammered, System 2 gets starved.
And the cascading effects are measurable. Higher baseline death anxiety across Western populations, avoidance of end of life planning even when people know they should do it. Complicated grief, meaning grief that doesn't resolve through normal processes, affecting an estimated 7 to 10% of bereaved individuals. Medical overtreatment at end of life because both patients and doctors are culturally trained to see death as failure. And as TMT research shows, a population that becomes more rigid, more tribal, and more materialistic every time mortality is triggered, which, given the news cycle, is basically every single day.
And here's a cross-cultural comparison that makes the mismatch painfully clear. The people of Bhutan are said to contemplate death 5 times a day, not as a morbid exercise, as a practice. And Bhutan consistently ranks among the happiest nations in the world on subjective well-being surveys. Meanwhile, Americans who avoid thinking about death, the dedication of an Olympic athlete training for avoidance, report increasing rates of existential anxiety, particularly among younger generations.
In Japan, the concept of mono no aware, which translates roughly as the pathos of things, finds beauty precisely in impermanence. The cherry blossoms aren't beautiful despite the fact that they fall. They're beautiful because they fall. In Mexico, Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead, turns death into a celebration of continuity between the living and the dead, a festival of color and food and memory and joy, not a grim reckoning. These aren't exotic curiosities. These are cultures that still have both death systems intact, cultures that feed the integration system as actively as the fear system, and they have the psychological outcomes to show for it.
The mismatch in a single sentence. You evolve with 2 systems for processing death, one for fear and one for meaning. And your culture only feeds one of them while letting the other atrophy, like a muscle you never use.
So let's talk about what our ancestors actually did, because it wasn't denial, and it wasn't collapse. It was something far more sophisticated. Across cultures and across millennia, human beings built what I think of as technologies of dying well. Not technologies in the silicon sense, technologies in the original sense, systematic methods for achieving a desired outcome. And the desired outcome was this: hold the fear and the meaning at the same time.
Let's walk through some of these technologies because they're astonishing in both their diversity and their convergence. Start with the Stoics. In ancient Greece and Rome, the Stoic philosophers developed a practice called memento mori, Latin for remember that you will die. This wasn't a Halloween decoration, it was a daily practice. Marcus Aurelius, Roman emperor and practicing Stoic, wrote, uh, wrote, in the, wrote in his meditations that you should think of yourself as already dead every morning when you wake, not to be depressed, to be liberated. Because when you genuinely accept that your time is finite, pettiness loses its grip, grudges feel ridiculous, and the present moment, the only one you are guaranteed, becomes almost unbearably precious.
In Tibetan Buddhism, they developed what's known as the Bardo Todol, commonly translated as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, though a more accurate translation is liberation through hearing during the intermediate state. This is essentially a detailed navigational guide for the consciousness of a dying person. It's read aloud at the bedside for days before and after death, describing the stages of dissolution the mind passes through. It's not metaphorical. It's a practical, step-by-step manual, detailed enough that you could argue it's the world's oldest transition guide. Imagine IKEA instructions, but for dying. Except these actually make sense on first read.
In Hindu philosophy, the concept of samsara, the cycle of death and rebirth, frames death not as an ending but as a transformation within an ongoing process. The Bhagavad Gita, one of the foundational texts, contains entire chapters dedicated to understanding death as a shedding of the body, the way you shed your old clothes. Krishna tells Arjun, the soul is not born, nor does it die. It's a cosmological framework that makes death as wardrobe change rather than an annihilation.
In Indigenous Australian cultures, ceremonies surrounding death can last weeks. They involve elaborate song cycles that map the deceased person's spiritual journey back to their ancestral landscape. The community participates collectively, not as passive mourners, but as active guides. The grief is expressed through movement, song, art, and collective storytelling, engaging every sensory modality. It's not getting over the loss, it's metabolizing it, the way the body metabolizes food, breaking it down, absorbing what nourishes, and integrating it into the ongoing life of the community.
In West African and African diaspora traditions, death is often understood as a transition to ancestorhood, a promotion, not a termination. The newly deceased becomes a spiritual source for the living community, someone you can consult, honor, and maintain an ongoing relationship with. The jazz funeral tradition in New Orleans, which descends from these practices, captures this beautifully. The procession starts slow and mournful, and then after the burial, the music shifts, the tempo rises, the brass band kicks in. People dance in the street. It's a celebration, not because they are not sad, but because grief and joy are not opposites, they're neighbors.
In the Japanese tradition of Obon, families welcome the spirits of deceased ancestors back to the family home each August. They light welcome fires, called makuabe, prepare meals, clean graves, and participate in community dances called bon odore. It's essentially a family reunion where some of the guests are dead, and is treated with the same warmth, preparation, and normalcy as any other family gathering.
Now, here's a neuroscience convergence point that makes all of this so striking. Every single one of these traditions does the same handful of things neurologically. They trigger oxytocin release through communal bonding and physical proximity. They activate the prefrontal cortex through narrative construction, giving grief a story structure that the brain can process. They produce collective effervescence through synchronized movement, chanting, singing, or dancing, which downregulates the amygdala's fear response. They create temporal structure, meaning they give grief a beginning, a middle, and an end, which reduces the feeling of being overwhelmed. And they maintain continuing bonds with the deceased, which attachment research shows is far healthier than the let go and move on model that dominates Western grief, counseling.
Every single tradition arrived at the same neural destination through different cultural pathways. Stoic philosophy and Aboriginal song cycles, and Tibetan death manuals, and New Orleans jazz funerals all converge on the same basic principle. Death needs a container. Fear needs a counterweight. And that counterweight is communal, embodied, intentional practice. Our ancestors didn't beat death. They didn't pretend it wasn't happening. They developed technologies for living alongside it. And those technologies weren't luxuries. They were as essential to psychological survival as fire was to physical survival. So if Hollywood is the amplifier, what's the corrective? What does recalibration look like in 2026? Enter the death positive movement and the rise of death doulas. The numbers here tell an extraordinary story of cultural recalibration. The National End of Life Doula Alliance saw its membership grow from roughly 260 in 2019 to nearly 1,600 by 2024. That's more than a five-fold increase in 5 years. NELDA, International End-of-Life Doula Association, has trained nearly 6,500 doulas worldwide since its founding in 2015. Research on death doulas is growing at an annual rate of about 9.5%. And it's not just practitioners. At cafes, city gatherings where people meet over tea and cake to discuss mortality with the same casualness you discuss a Netflix series have spread to over 80 countries. Green burials are surging. U.S. cremation rates are projected to exceed 82% by 2045, driven partly by a desire for simpler, more personally meaningful end-of-life options.
When death doulas are doing is essentially building system 2, the integration system that modern culture dismantled. Think about what a death doula actually does. They sit with the dying person and their family. They facilitate conversations about what death means to this particular person. They help create legacy projects, a recipe book, an audio recording, a letter collection that give the dying person a sense of symbolic continuity. They plan vigils, communal gatherings where loved ones share stories, play music, and hold space. They guide families through the physical process of dying so that natural changes like shifts in breathing or skin mottling are understood as part of the process, not as something terrifying.
Compare that to the Hollywood model. When someone is dying, the camera focuses on the surviving character's anguish. The dying person is often unconscious, passive, reduced to an object of grief. The death itself is a plot device, not a human experience. In the aftermath, a montage, funeral in the rain, maybe a slow motion shot of the survivor staring out the window. The death doula model inverts every single one of those tropes. The dying person is the protagonist, not the victim. The community is present and active, not helpless. The process is conscious and intentional, not something that just happens to people. And meaning isn't extracted from the death after the fact. It's woven into the dying itself.
Alan Goodman, the journalist and the founder of the Conversation Project, compared the rise of death doulas to the earlier movement for natural childbirth. And I think that analogy is perfect. Birth was once seen as purely a medical event. Women reclaimed it as a human event. They brought doulas into the birthing room. They demanded agency over the process. The same reclamation is now happening at the other end of life. People are saying, this is not just a medical event, this is a human experience. And we want someone in the room who understands that.
And the data supports the shift. Research on death acceptance shows that higher levels of death acceptance predict lower levels of anxiety and depression over time. A study on death preparation education for nurses found that a structured 10-session program reduced death anxiety scores from 3.75 to 2.40 on a standardized scale, a 36% reduction. When people are given tools to engage with death rather than avoid it, the fear response decreases, not because the fear disappears, but because the integration system finally has something to work with.
From an evolutionary perspective, what's happening is a return to baseline. For 300,000 years, dying was a communal, ritualized, sported experience. For about 150 years, we handed it to institutions and entertainment companies. And now, a growing number of people are pulling it back. They're rebuilding the antenna that Hollywood replaced with an amplifier. And that's something your wide ape brain already knows how to use. It's been waiting for this signal for 150 years. All right, rapid fire. Sarah and I are going to trade this back and forth. These are the numbers that tell the story. Ready?
69% of Americans say death is a subject that their society generally avoids.
Only 32% of Americans are willing to talk about death. It ranks dead last among taboo topics, behind money, behind sex, behind politics and religion.
35% of Gen Z think about death every single day. That's more than any other generation.
37% of Americans haven't done anything to prepare for death. Among millennials, 46%.
71% of Americans say the healthcare priority at end of life should be helping people die without pain and stress. Only 19% prioritize extending life as long as possible.
NEDA, that is National End of Life Doula Alliance, membership grew more than fivefold between 2019 and 2024.
And ELDA, International End of Life Doula Association, has trained nearly 6,500 end-of-life doulas worldwide since 2015.
Death doula research is growing at an annual rate of 9.5%.
A meta-analysis of terror management theory research across 277 experiments found that reminders of death produce moderate to strong effects on worldview events. Your brain doesn't just get scared. It gets ideologically rigid.
A structured death preparation education program for nurses reduced death anxiety scores from 3.75 to 2.40. That's a 36% reduction from a 10-session program.
73% of people who have started planning a meaningful legacy described the process as bringing peace and reduced anxiety.
U.S. cremation rates are projected to reach 82% by 2045.
The profession of death doula was essentially invented in 2003. 2 decades later, it's one of the fastest growing areas of community-based caregiving in the developed world.
Ernst Becker published The Denial of Death in 1973. He received the Pulitzer Prize 2 months after its publication. He was already dying of cancer. His first words to journalist Sam Kean, who came to interview him in the hospital, were, "You're catching me in the extremis. This is a test of everything I've written about death." He died at 49. The book has never gone out of print.
So let's go back to where we started. That kid on the living room floor, watching Mufasa fall. That wasn't just a sad scene in a movie. That was the beginning of a cultural education in death avoidance. The first of thousands of lessons teaching you that death is the enemy, the thing to be fought, feared, and ultimately failed by.
But you're not that kid anymore. You have access to something Hollywood will never put on screen. The 300,000 year inheritance of every human culture that ever figured out how to die well. The mismatch isn't that you fear death. Of course, you fear death. You're a biological organism with a survival drive and a prefrontal cortex that can imagine its own annihilation. That fear is legitimate hardware. The mismatch is that your fear has no container, no ritual, no community, no counter narrative. Just an endless feed of fictional deaths and a culture that changes the subject.
Death doulas are rebuilding those containers. The death positive movement is opening those conversations. Wisdom traditions that have long been doing this work for millennia are still here, still available, still waiting for you to show up. And you can start today, right now, with a single honest conversation or a single moment of memento mori. Your ancestors didn't defeat death. They befriended it, and they were better at living because of it.
If this episode hit something for you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Wednesday on the Scholar's Fire, we're going deep. Friday on Ritual Friday, we'll walk you through these 3 specific ancestral death practices you can adopt right now, from the Stoic memento mori to the Japanese Obon tradition, to the Mexican Dia de los Muertos framework. We're the neuroscience behind why each of them works.
Follow us on all platforms at The Wired Ape. Visit thewiredape.com to go deeper. Check out Sylvester at sylvester.com for the behavioral intelligence behind your financial decisions, and the management messiah for leadership and strategy through the human lens.
Remember, you're a brilliant animal in a concrete jungle. Be kind to your wide ape brain.
I'm Sarah.
And I'm Wish. This has been Mismatch Monday. See you Wednesday.